My name is Julia Kark Callander. I am a visiting assistant professor at Appalachian State University, and I'm the author of the pandemic literature entry in Gale Literary Criticism. Broadly defined, pandemic literature depicts or addresses or attempts to interpret disease outbreaks over a large geographical area, both fictional and non-fictional. So it really spans the gamut between historical fiction and science fiction. One thing that pandemic literature does very well is that it is very clearly the product of a particular historical moment in which it was composed. So for example, Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which is written in the 1720s, really unsurprisingly for Defoe, focuses on some of the questions of divine intervention, free will, religious interpretation. By contrast, Arthur Mervyn, which was written only 70 years later by the American author Charles Brockden Brown, is very much a product of the early Republic time period in American history, and it's very engaged in questions of the health of the body politic and the anxiety of a sort of increasingly anonymous public sphere. Kind of interesting for 2021, Arthur Mervyn actually shows what I believe is the first scene of people wearing masks on the street avoiding each other. And then it also is very clearly engaging with questions about the circulation of goods and bodies in the transatlantic slave trade and reading the yellow fever epidemic that hits Philadelphia in 1793 as a sort of symptom or figure for the other kinds of circulation going on. Another example of how sort of historically specific these texts are is Camus' The Plague, which was published in the late 1940s. And while it is just like Defoe's book about the bubonic plague, it's also very, very much about World War II. It depicts a town in colonial Algeria under quarantine, but the way that the characters really think about the extent of the sort of lethality of the bubonic plague is very much a product of the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, of nuclear bombs, and to a lesser extent of the Vichy occupation of France. But more recently, there are quite a number of zombie novels that are very clearly tied to late capitalism and the kind of like mindlessness of labor. So you have a book like Ling Ma's Severance, where the would-be zombies, they're called the Fever, but they don't really do much. They actually just kind of repeat the same boring cyclical tasks that they did prior to infection. That was composed in the early 21st century, and it's very much sort of about like, are we all already mindless zombies under late capitalism? Another very recent book, Station 11, is very clearly sort of thinking through questions of the post-human, what comes after the Anthropocene. So it's set 20 years after a coronavirus-like flu wipes out most of the world's population. But the landscape or the world that these characters inhabit after the end is just littered with digital objects and things that have no meaning or no value in this kind of post-apocalyptic world. And so clearly thinking through some of the issues surrounding climate change and the digitization of our lives and what might happen after that. So even though pandemic literature tends to be very reflective of the particular historical moment in which it was composed, there are also a lot of pretty consistent concerns, themes, questions that really stretch across different periods, countries, and genres. And the first one of those has to do with the idea of the body politic, whether or not particular texts actually use that kind of early modern political formulation of the idea. But they are very consistently engaging in questions of how do we use the individual human body as a figure for other kinds of abstract collectives or communities with boundaries. And kind of along with that, of course, is the treatment of alterity, otherness, foreignness, xenophobia, and so on. And you can even see this in something like Dracula, which is, of course, actually a pandemic novel in some ways, because Dracula, comes to the island of Great Britain, and his arrival there from the kind of exotic eastern edges of Europe is seen as him bringing a bloodborne pathogen to this island that had boundaries that are then very clearly kind of figured onto the individual body boundaries of like white British femininity. And so like the assault of one white British woman is somehow kind of overlaid with an assault on a broad national body politic in those gendered and racialized terms. Second, very kind of easily accessible metaphor that turns up across a wide range of pandemic literature is circulation. So not only are pathogens circulating, but goods, people, and information are circulating, whether it's gossip or the transatlantic slave trade or really anything in between. You can see that both of these kind of central metaphors that get taken up by all kinds of pandemic literature encourage texts to foreground issues of interpretation and intertextuality. To this day, I think Susan Sontag's work, Illness as Metaphor and AIDS and Its Metaphors, are among the best examples of a kind of focused critique of this tendency that we all have to read other things as if they were disease and read disease as if they were other things. Many texts do this kind of unself-consciously. Many others actually kind of highlight it and hold it up for critique. With the focus on bodies and circulation, there's a real tendency for pandemic literature to think about books themselves as porous and interconnected bodies, kind of circulating around each other, penetrating each other, appropriating from each other. This is most clearly seen in Colson Whitehead's novel Zone 1, which is not only a novel about zombies, but it is itself kind of a zombie novel in that it consumes and digests and appropriates widely from all kinds of different literature and pop culture. By the end of the novel, you realize that you're actually reading James Joyce's short story, The Dead, except instead of the snow that's falling everywhere in the famous Joyce story, the characters are being surrounded by the falling ash of the incinerated corpses of zombies. So Whitehead in particular, but many others, really take the kind of self-fulfilling quality of these easily accessible metaphors of circulation, interpretation, boundaries, body politic, and call attention to themselves in a way that is kind of very postmodern, even before you get to the 20th century. So a book like Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year does really weird things narratively and in terms of form and genre as well. And that generic hybridity really characterizes a lot of this literature. Fundamentally, pandemic literature is interdisciplinary and is really excitingly adjacent to a number of different disciplines, whether it's thinking about highbrow and lowbrow culture, as well as all of these kind of political and ethical questions about public health, and finally about history. You know, what gets recorded, what gets represented, what role do the arts play in memorializing particularly actual crises. This literature highlights certain aspects of how we talk and think about the present pandemic, and I think gives us more tools to think through what we are ourselves going through right now. Central to many of these texts is a preoccupation with the definition of communities and populations. How are boundaries drawn around different groups of people, whether that is, of course, what counts as a household or what counts as a pod, to what counts as a risk group or risk population, up to questions about like, what is the role of citizenship in allocating resources and standard of care and so on. In many ways, this literature also interrogates the irreconcilable tension between public health, the greater good, the common good on the one hand, and individual liberty on the other hand, which we're all too well aware of at this point. It's something like Albert Camus' book, The Plague. You see people breaking quarantine to get to their loved ones. Many of these novels and other texts are really thinking through the ethical as well as the epidemiological stakes of that tension. Another way that I think this literature gives us a way into thinking about the present crisis is in questions of documentation and witnessing. These texts think about the usefulness of statistics and what do or do not statistics really do for us in attempting to understand what really happened or what it was really like. Along with that, you have texts that are interested in witnessing. So the main character in Ling Ma's Severance, she stays in New York after everybody else has already died or left the city. And she basically, I mean, it was written in 2012, but she basically runs an Instagram account, taking pictures of New York as it's been emptied and kind of trying to like shout out into the void some sense of like, this is what it was like. And of course, there's another kind of meta-reflexive question there about what the role of the arts is in both documenting and processing what global crises look like. And that's going to be a question that I think we'll be asking for decades to come, if not more. Finally, as an aside, and one thing that my students really picked up on when I taught a pandemic literature class last semester is that from Camus to Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11 to Severance, even to some zombie films like 28 Days Later and The Girl with All the Gifts, the apocalypse can be kind of boring and kind of quiet. You know, whether that's because the action is set 20 years after the fact, or it's set in a town under quarantine, where like these people have nothing else to do in Camus, to the kind of alienated labor of emptied out Manhattan in Severance. In 28 Days Later, the Danny Boyle film from 2001, the majority of the film is focused on an empty landscape and kind of a post-human vision of Britain rather than like brains being eaten and stuff. That was one thing that I really found resonated with my students. I guess it makes us question how we think about disaster and the kind of scale and temporality of disaster in ways that is not just relevant to the present global health crisis, but also to climate change and other kinds of crises that are not very exciting on a day-to-day basis. I taught a seminar on pandemic literature last semester in fall 2020, and I proposed it back in February or March when I thought, you know, oh, we'll be able to think historically about like the COVID that happened. And that clearly is not how things played out. I've taught similar courses at other institutions in the past pre-COVID, and it's been really interesting to spend time with students revisiting many of the same texts in what has become a drastically different context. I approached this past semester with quite a bit of trepidation. As I was just saying, you know, just like crises can be boring and quiet and happen on a different scale, so too can trauma. And in trying to think about what like a culturally responsive approach to this material would look like, I was very, very careful with how I presented material, how I framed the course in not just, you know, content warnings and keeping the lines of communication open, but also really trying to respect the diversity of experiences that students might be having with COVID in the classroom. And I know that's true in any semester with any topic, but it felt particularly urgent in the course of this past class. But what I found was that with very few exceptions, students were really hungry to talk about this material, and that it felt cathartic. And it was also really exciting series of teaching moments to find that students, most of whom are not literature people or even humanities people. And so if something was written 20 years ago, it's like, it could have been written 100 years ago, right? But that things were not only relevant, it was just kind of completely shifted, I think, many students' perspectives on what old writing could do, and that kind of trans-historical connection. At the same time that I was very careful about getting students to historicize all of these texts and think about how, you know, something from the 90s is going to be very different than something from the 1940s, which is going to be very different than something like Zone 1, which was written clearly in the wake of 9/11. That was one of the more rewarding things for me as an instructor. I think there was also just a kind of gut level realization that students could feel seen by texts that were written by people who had different identities from them, by people who lived in different times, and that something that seemed so novel to them and to all of us actually had happened many, many times before. One of the moments that sticks with me the most is in Camus' The Plague, where the main character, who's a physician, starts thinking about what it would be like to think about 10 million people dead. He realizes he can't do it. And of course, again, he's writing in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the atomic bombs, but he tries to get down to like, what's the largest number of people of loss that I can really fathom, that I can really wrap my head around. And for him, it's a large movie theater. He's like, maybe if I look at a movie theater full of people, I can actually like make it land for myself what it means to lose each of those lives. And then of course, because he's a physician, he's like, so how many movie theaters would I need before I can like get up to 10 million? And kind of proves his own point about the abstraction. And I think as we, we approach a year of COVID, there's a real intellectual and ethical burden on all of us to kind of wrestle with those questions about loss at scale. I think the other thing that I really appreciated working with students on this past semester was that in some ways pandemic literature teaches itself, because it's always already sort of aware of how it's doing interpretation. In these novels and movies and TV shows, you see characters looking at images or looking at data and trying to interpret it. And especially working with non-majors, it really gave a much better kind of perspective, multi-dimensional approach to thinking about what interpretation of literature is in the humanities.